Before this man, war in southern Africa was almost a ritual. Armies lined up at a distance, hurled their spears, and withdrew. Casualties were often light. It was closer to a dangerous sport than a war of annihilation. He looked at that tradition and burned it to the ground. He forced his warriors to fight face to face, blade to blade, close enough to smell their enemy's fear. He banned sandals and made men run barefoot over thorns until their feet could withstand anything, including the discipline that killed the hesitant faster than any enemy ever could. In barely a decade, he turned a small, forgotten clan of a few hundred people into an empire that reshaped an entire region of Africa through a psychology of fear so complete that some of his enemies surrendered before he ever arrived. This is the dark psychology of Shaka Zulu. He was born around 1787, the product of a forbidden relationship between a minor chief named Senzanga Kona and a woman named Nandi. Their union violated custom, and when Nandi's pregnancy could no longer be denied, the child was declared illegitimate in the eyes of his father's clan. His very name carries the wound. Shaka is said to derive from a word used to explain away Nandi's condition, a dismissive term, essentially calling the pregnancy an intestinal parasite rather than admit the truth. He entered the world as an inconvenient lie that everyone pretended to believe. His father eventually took Nandi as a minor wife, but the marriage was miserable, and mother and son were eventually cast out, forced to wander from one relative's homestead to another, dependent on the charity of people who resented them. Shaka grew up mocked for his illegitimate birth, for his mother's disgrace, and, by several accounts, for physical characteristics the other boys used to humiliate him. A childhood built entirely from rejection does one of two things to a person. It breaks them, or it forges something that can never be humiliated again. Shaka chose, or perhaps was shaped into, the second path. Every insult became fuel. And when he finally found a place to prove himself, he did not simply want to succeed. He needed to make certain that no one could ever look down on him again. That place came in his teenage years, when Shaka was conscripted into the army of a regional chief named Dingus Wayo, who was busy absorbing smaller clans into a growing confederation. In Dingus Wayo's ranks, the outcast finally found a system where merit could overwrite birth. Shaka served with a ferocity and tactical intelligence that set him apart almost immediately. He rose through the ranks of the Ibutho, the age regiment system that organized young men into standing units, and caught the attention of his patron. When Shaka's father died in 1816, Dingus Wayo backed Shaka's claim to lead the Zulu, at the time, a minor clan of perhaps a few hundred people, a footnote among dozens of similar groups on the southern African landscape. Most men handed a kingdom that small would have spent their reign simply trying to survive among larger neighbors. Shaka looked at his tiny inheritance and began, almost immediately, to redesign the very nature of war itself, because he understood something his rivals did not. The clan with the most men does not necessarily win. The clan whose men are the most feared does. Traditional warfare in the region centered on a long throwing spear, hurled from a distance. It allowed a warrior to wound an enemy and then retreat, a style of combat that preserved lives, but rarely produced total victories. Wars could drag on indefinitely, refought season after season, without ever truly ending anything. Shaka introduced a different weapon, a short-handled stabbing spear, with a long blade designed not for throwing, but for close, brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Its name, Iklwa, is said to imitate the sucking sound the blade made when pulled from a wound. He is said to have trained relentlessly with the design himself, before ever issuing it to his men. To use this weapon, a warrior could no longer stand at a comfortable distance. He had to close in, shield to shield, and kill or be killed within arm's reach. Shaka paired it with a larger, heavier cowhide shield, taught specifically to hook an enemy's shield aside, exposing his ribs to the blade beneath. Understand what this actually did, psychologically, to every man who carried it. Distance allows hesitation. A thrown spear can be a half-effort, a face-saving gesture from a safe range. But a stabbing spear at arm's length offers no such comfort. You either commit completely, or you die. Shaka had engineered a weapon that made courage mandatory rather than optional, because the old escape routes for a frightened man no longer existed. This is the first principle. Proximity is the truest test of will. By eliminating distance, Shaka eliminated the option of a fake fight. Every battle his soldiers entered was now, by design, a real one. Alongside the new weapon, Shaka developed a battlefield formation that became legendary. The Horns of the Bull. His army was divided into distinct sections. The chest, his strongest, most experienced warriors, advanced directly at the enemy's center, absorbing and holding their attention. Meanwhile, two flanking regiments, the Horns, swept rapidly around both sides, encircling the enemy from behind. A reserve force, the Loins, sat hidden and ready, watching the outcome and either reinforcing weakness or exploiting a coming victory. The genius of the formation was not merely tactical. It was psychological, on two levels at once. For the enemy commander, it meant that the moment his flanks were threatened, his own men would sense encirclement, and the fear of being surrounded breaks discipline faster than almost any other battlefield event. Soldiers who believe escape is impossible often stop fighting rationally and start fighting or fleeing in panic. And for Shaka's own men, the formation offered something equally important: certainty. Every soldier understood his exact function, his exact position, and the mathematics of the coming victory before the first spear was thrown. An army that believes in its own inevitable win fights differently than one that merely hopes to survive. This is the second principle. Control your enemy's fear of what is coming, and control your own soldiers' confidence in what is coming. And you have already won the psychological battle before the physical one begins. But new weapons and formations meant nothing without men capable of executing them without hesitation. So Shaka rebuilt his soldiers from the ground up, starting almost absurdly with their feet. He banned sandals within his ranks. His warriors were made to march and drill barefoot across the harsh southern African terrain, including fields deliberately strewn with thorns, until their soles toughened enough to run at speed over almost any surface, without slowing. It was said that any man who flinched, hesitated, or complained during this training could be executed on the spot as an example to the rest. This detail matters more than it first appears. Shaka was not merely conditioning bodies. He was engineering absolute obedience under physical duress. A soldier who has already endured pain without complaint, under the threat of instant death for hesitation, becomes a soldier who will not hesitate when a real enemy stands in front of him. The training and the discipline were, in effect, a single continuous test, and failing it in peacetime carried the same penalty as failing it in war. His army trained to cover extraordinary distances at speed, arriving at enemies who believed themselves days away from any threat. Speed itself became a psychological weapon. An enemy who has no warning, has no time to build courage, gather allies, or even properly arm himself. This is the third principle, and it is the coldest one. Discipline enforced through terror produces soldiers who fear their own commander more than they fear the enemy. And a man more afraid of Shaka than of death itself does not run from a battlefield. As Shaka's methods proved themselves in battle after battle, something remarkable began to happen. The wars grew shorter, and some of them stopped requiring battles at all. Word of the new Zulu way of war spread across the region. The close-quarters slaughter, the encircling horns, the barefoot warriors who did not retreat because retreating was more dangerous than advancing. Neighboring clans, hearing what awaited them, increasingly chose submission and tribute over the near certainty of annihilation. Entire communities were absorbed into the growing Zulu kingdom, having never faced a single Zulu spear. This is a principle we have seen before, in a different empire, on a different continent, centuries earlier. Fear is far cheaper than force. Every battle costs warriors, time and resources, even in victory. A reputation terrifying enough to produce surrender costs nothing at all. Shaka understood, just as Genghis Khan understood on the Asian steppe, that the ultimate goal of an army is not to fight constantly, It is to become so feared that fighting becomes unnecessary. Within roughly a decade, the tiny clan of a few hundred that Shaka inherited had grown, through conquest and absorption, into a kingdom controlling a significant portion of southern Africa. A transformation of speed and scale that stunned the neighboring peoples and, eventually, the European colonial powers watching from the coast. But the same psychological absolutism that built Shaka's kingdom eventually turned inward, with devastating consequences. Shaka's mother, Nandi, the woman who had endured exile and humiliation alongside him, died in 1827, and Shaka's response revealed the full, uncontrolled depth of a psychology built entirely on domination and never on release. He declared a period of national mourning enforced with terrifying severity. Sources describe brutal punishments, even executions, for those judged insufficiently grief-stricken for failing to weep with enough visible anguish, for being caught eating or drinking during the mourning period, for simply appearing too composed. Crops reportedly went untended. Normal life across the kingdom was suspended under the weight of a grief that had become compulsory, measured and enforced by fear exactly, like everything else Shaka had ever built. This is the darker mirror of the first four principles. The same mind that had engineered obedience through the fear of instant punishment could not process personal loss through any channel except that identical machinery. Grief itself became another arena for total control, and in demanding it, Shaka revealed that the empire of fear he had built had no release valve, not even for himself. A system with only one setting, absolute compliance, cannot bend to accommodate a human being's private sorrow. It can only expand the terror to cover it. The mourning crisis, layered onto years of escalating harshness, paranoia, and increasingly erratic decisions, had steadily eroded the loyalty Shaka once commanded so completely. Among those closest to him were his own half-brothers, Dingain and Mlengana, men who had watched the kingdom's growing instability and understood, better than most, exactly how Shaka dealt with any perceived threat. Waiting any longer risked becoming his next target, rather than his successor. In September of 1828, the two brothers, along with another conspirator, assassinated Shaka, stabbing him to death, according to tradition, near his royal homestead. The founder of an empire built entirely on the principle that fear guarantees obedience was killed by the very men closest to his throne. Men who had learned that principle better than anyone, and who understood that Shaka's own system offered them no other way to survive his growing paranoia. The kingdom he built endured under Dingain, but the man who forged it in barely a decade was gone within it, killed not by a foreign army or a rival king, but by the machinery of fear turning, finally, on its own creator. So what does Shaka Zulu really teach us? That fear, engineered precisely enough, is one of the most efficient tools of power ever devised. He rewrote the physical and psychological rules of warfare in his region, forcing courage through proximity, breaking enemy morale through encirclement, manufacturing absolute obedience through discipline harsher than any battlefield, and eventually making his mere reputation more effective than his army. In under a decade, an outcast child built one of the most feared kingdoms on the continent, but his ending carries the full weight of the warning. A system of total fear has no mechanism for mercy, not toward enemies, not toward subjects, and, in the end, not even toward its own creator's grief. Shaka built a machine that ran on one fuel only, the terror of consequence. And when his own judgment became too erratic, even for the men who depended on him, that same machine offered them no path except the one he had taught them: strike first or be destroyed. The uncomfortable question his story leaves behind is this: can total control ever really be permanent? Or does every system built purely on fear eventually turn, inevitably, on the person who built it? If this changed the way you see power, subscribe. Because here, we don't study history to escape the past. We study it to understand the forces that shape people, even today, and to see fear used as an empire-building weapon on another continent entirely. Watch our video on Genghis Khan next. or see the philosophy of winning before the battle even begins. The story of Sun Tzu.